สวัสดีนะครับท่านผู้มีเกียรติทุกท่านครับย้อนกลับไปเมื่อประมาณเดือนมีนาคมที่เราจัดบางกอกฟินเทคแฟร์ในห้องนี้กับหลายท่านก็ได้มาร่วมกับเราท่านคงจำได้ว่าในวันนั้นธนาคารแห่งประเทศไทยได้พูดถึง3เรื่องสำคัญที่อาจจะเรียกว่าเป็น guiding principle ของการพัฒนาเทคโนโลยีที่มาใช้ในระบบการเงินของไทยมี3คำสำคัญนะครับคำแรกก็คือ productivityทำอย่างไรที่จะให้ผลิตภาพประสิทธิภาพ productivity ของภาคการเงินและก็ระบบเศรษฐกิจไทยเนี่ยสามารถที่จะก้าวกระโดดได้นะครับคำที่2ก็คือ immunity หรือทำอย่างไรที่จะให้เรามีภูมิคุ้มกันมีภูมิต้านทานที่ดีสามารถรับแรงปะทะใหม่ๆมีการบริหารความเสี่ยงที่ดีขึ้นได้และคำที่3ก็คือ inclusivity ทำอย่างไรที่จะให้การพัฒนาในเรื่องของภาคการเงินยังประโยชน์ให้กับคนส่วนใหญ่ของประเทศนะครับไม่ใช่เฉพาะเพียงแค่บริษัท ขนาดใหญ่หรือว่าสถาบันการเงินขนาดใหญ่เท่านั้นยังรวมไปถึง SME รวมไปถึงประชาชนโดยทั่วไปด้วยนะครับเรื่องการพัฒนาเทคโนโลยีอย่างที่เราทราบกันนะครับก็มีทางเลือกที่หลากหลายมากนะครับแต่ก็มีพัฒนาการทางเทคโนโลยีหลายด้านที่กำลังเปลี่ยนอาจจะเรียกว่าเปลี่ยนหลักคิดวิธีคิดนะครับแนวคิดหรือว่าระบบเก่าๆที่เลยคุ้นชินซึ่งธนาคารแห่งประเทศไทยก็ให้ความสำคัญกับการที่จะพยายามเสาะหาทำความเข้าใจนะครับทำงานร่วมกับพันธมิตรทั้งในประเทศและก็ต่างประเทศที่จะหาคำตอบที่จะมาตอบโจทย์ทั้ง3คำที่ผมได้เรียนไว้ไม่ว่าจะเป็น productivity immunity หรือว่า inclusivity นะครับเทคโนโลยีที่สำคัญอย่างที่เราทราบกันอันหนึ่งก็คือเทคโนโลยีที่เรียกว่าเป็น DLT distributed ledger technology นะครับหรือเป็น ledger ที่กระจายตัวบล็อกเชนก็อาจจะเป็นอีกชื่อหนึ่งของ DLT ที่เราใช้เรียกกันจนคุ้นนะครับเทคโนโลยีนี้เป็นเทคโนโลยีที่มีความสำคัญมากเพราะเปลี่ยนจากแนวคิดจากการที่มีบัญชีกลางหรือ central book ไปเป็น distributed ledger เป็น ledger แบบลักษณะที่กระจายตัวและคนที่ต้องคิดมากที่สุดเกี่ยวกับเรื่องนี้ก็หนีไม่พ้นนะครับคือคนที่มีคำว่า central อยู่ในชื่อของตัวเองก็คือ central bank นะครับรูปแบบการทำงานของเราก็จะต้องเปลี่ยนไปนะครับจากที่เป็นธนาคารกลางวิธีการทำงานหลายอย่างก็จะต้องให้ความสำคัญกับการที่จะมีการทำงานลักษณะที่เป็น distributed มากขึ้นนะครับวันนี้ก็เป็นโอกาสที่น่ายินดียิ่งนะครับที่เราจะได้มาเรียนรู้ร่วมกันนะครับใน blockchain the series at the BOT ที่ใช้คำว่า the series เพราะว่าอันนี้เป็นเพียงแค่จุดเริ่มต้นนะครับเราหวังว่าเราจะจัดงานในลักษณะที่ได้มีการพูดคุยกันเรื่องของเทคโนโลยีเรื่องของแอปพลิเคชันที่เกิดจาก blockchain ต่อเนื่องไปตลอดนะครับในชิ้นนี้ไปอาจจะไม่ได้จัดในลักษณะที่เป็นห้องใหญ่แบบนี้นะครับแต่อาจจะจัดเป็นเฉพาะเรื่องมากขึ้นเพราะว่าถ้าเราจะทำให้เทคโนโลยีสามารถเกิดประโยชน์ให้กับระบบเศรษฐกิจไทยได้จริงคงไม่ใช่เป็นเรื่องเทคโนโลยีอย่างเดียวแต่ต้องเป็นเรื่องของการปรับระบบนิเวศทั้งหมดปรับอีโคซิสเต็มทั้งหมดนะครับซึ่งหมายถึงการทำงานร่วมกับพันธมิตรนอกจากสาขาการเงินและก็นอกจากสาขาทางด้านเทคโนโลยีด้วยหลายท่านคงเห็นแอปพลิเคชันในวิดีทัศน์เมื่อสักครู่นะครับต้องมีภาคเศรษฐกิจจริงที่เข้ามาเกี่ยวข้องแล้วก็จะเห็นว่าในเรื่องของการค้าระหว่างประเทศก็ดีเนี่ยก็จะเห็นตั้งแต่บริษัทโลจิสติกส์นะครับก็เข้ามาเกี่ยวข้องกับภาคการเงินในการทำเรื่องธุรกรรมการค้าระหว่างประเทศโดยอาศัย DLT เพื่อให้เกิดประสิทธิภาพเพิ่มขึ้นสูงมากครับเรื่องของกฎหมายนะครับก็เป็นเรื่องที่สำคัญมากที่จะทำให้บล็อกเชนสามารถที่ทุกคนสามารถใช้ประโยชน์แล้วก็มีความมั่นใจสบายใจได้นะครับไม่เพิ่มความเสี่ยงเชิงระบบเข้ามาเพิ่มมากขึ้นก็ต้องขอบพระคุณนะครับทุกท่านที่ให้เกียรติธนาคารแห่งประเทศไทยอีกครั้งหนึ่งและก็มาร่วมกันในงานของเราในวันนี้และอย่างที่เรียนนะครับว่าเรื่องนี้เป็นเรื่องที่จะสร้างประโยชน์ให้กับระบบเศรษฐกิจไทยได้มหาศาลนะครับทำให้เราสามารถลิฟต์ล็อกได้ไกลมากนะครับทั้งเพิ่มประสิทธิภาพเพิ่มผลิตภาพให้กับระบบเศรษฐกิจไทยสร้างภูมิคุ้มกันภูมิต้านทานให้กับระบบเศรษฐกิจไทยไปพร้อมๆกับการยังประโยชน์ให้กับคนทุกภาคส่วนนะครับในระบบเศรษฐกิจไทยไม่ใช่เพียงแค่ธุรกิจขนาดใหญ่เท่านั้นและก็หวังว่าคงจะได้พบกันอีกในรายการที่2 3 4นะครับใน Blockchain The Series ขอบคุณมากครับ
และก็ได้เวลาแล้วค่ะสำหรับเซสชันแรกของเรานะคะหัวข้อก็คือ Blockchain as a Future Infrastructure Technology Security and Use Cases ซึ่งเราได้รับเกียรติจากคุณปีเตอร์เดรอยนะคะ Senior Principal Blockchain Architect จากบริษัท Accenture ในวันนี้นะคะคุณปีเตอร์ค่ะเป็นผู้เชี่ยวชาญให้กับ Accenture มา 25 ปีแล้วค่ะมีความเชี่ยวชาญเป็นพิเศษในเรื่องของ Solutionนะคะ Security Architecture Strategy รวมไปถึงเรื่องของ Applied Cryptographic Research นะคะ Please join me to welcome Mr. Peter ขอเสียงปรบมือให้คุณปีเตอร์อีกครั้งค่ะ
ขอบคุณครับ I'm afraid that is pretty much all my Thai, so the rest is going to be in English, and I'll try and be slow. First of all, it's an honor to be here and a pleasure to be here. I've been in Thailand before, and it's nice to be back in a setting like this. So I hope you'll enjoy and learn something from what I'll have to say. So let's start with introduction. By introduction, I mean a little bit of a general introduction, first of all, to myself, very briefly, what I've done in this area. But mostly about what actually is blockchain. So I'll go a little bit deeper than it's a distributed ledger technology, and a little bit deeper than you get immutability and security. After that, a little bit about technology features and benefits. And by that I mean blockchain is a new technology that gives us new features like the mentioned immutability, like the security features you get out of blockchain and the distributed nature of a blockchain. But there is more to this, and that's going to be the fourth item on the agenda. There's more to this because it's not just technology benefits that you get out of this. So that's going to be the end of it. In the middle there I have a bit about security, because I think there's a lot of confusion about blockchain and security. Yes, blockchain has certain security features, but that's not the whole story. So I'll try and give a little bit more about that story in the third item. So let's start about myself. I think I heard that you pretty much did this already, so I'll give you a little bit more general background of myself. I'm Dutch. I was born in the Netherlands quite a long time ago, witness my gray hair. And I started indeed in cryptographic research. In fact, that was cryptographic research and anonymous digital cash in the early 90s. Those of you who have studied in this area might know the name of David Chaum. That was projects together with David Chaum. So that was kind of a predecessor to blockchain. And I must admit, I worked on a predecessor of blockchain, but I never bought any Bitcoin or anything like that, so I'm not rich. After that, and I'll just skip most of my career, the last couple of years I've pretty much focused exclusively on blockchain, and kind of highlights were Project Jasper. I was the solution architect for Project Jasper, which was a joint project doing post-trade settlement, meaning the settlement of transactions on the Toronto Stock Exchange. It's a proof of concept together with Toronto Stock Exchange, Payments Canada, which is the large value payment system between the banks in Canada and the Bank of Canada itself. I've also been involved in a project with the DTCC, Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation in the US, who do something similar to what we did with the Toronto Stock Exchange. They hold the shares and hold the accounting of the shares, the ledger of the shares, and do clearing. That was a large project. It was just announced this week to look at the performance of blockchain. And performance of blockchain has always been one of these things. You may have heard, like, the most famous example of blockchain still probably is Bitcoin. Bitcoin can only do 7 transactions a second. Well, at DTCC, we've proven that with R3 Corda and digital asset, we can actually reach up to 6,000 transactions a second in certain conditions. So this can actually perform quite well. That was a fairly lengthy project to see if we could do certain things specifically really at high performance on 2 different platforms. I'm going to skip most of the rest. I think you have a little bit of an idea of the background that I have in this area. So let's talk about blockchain. There's a lot of hype about blockchain. You can read the things on screen here. Everybody says it's the new internet and it's going to change everything. I don't know if it's going to change everything, but it can change a lot, and let's work towards making those changes. You probably also have seen the Gartner hype curve, where I think blockchain has now dropped off the peak of inflated expectations, and we're starting to drop in the, the valley of despair at the bottom. And I believe we're going to climb out of that, and we're going to get real implementations. And I'm starting to see that, in fact, in my day-to-day work. So this is another look at this. Blockchain started actually quite long ago. In the early 90s, the first things happened in that area. But it didn't really do anything until about 2012 when Bitcoin became live. And Bitcoin is an application on a blockchain. So that's a very important distinction to make. You have Bitcoin, which is an application, which is basically, it started out doing mostly payments between people, and at the moment it's more like kind of an electronic gold or something like that, a digital gold, because it's more an investment and speculation thing by now. But it is value transfer on a blockchain. So that's one application, and that's a very famous one, of course, and that's the one that started this whole area that got us all together here in the end. All these investments started increasing, and the next iteration of that started adding not just simple value transfer, because in the end that's a relatively simple thing, but also doing smart contracts, which means there's actually logic, there's programs running on the blockchain, and you can do smart things. If something happens, then the blockchain will react in one way. If something else happens, it will react in another way. And you can do very clever things with that. I don't think I should go into great amount of detail there, but what we expect is there will be a third wave of this, where this will really start becoming part of the fabric of, for example, financial services. And financial services is actually a little bit ahead of most other industries at the moment. The others are starting to catch up, but they're still a little bit ahead. We also expect this to have a large place in other corporate areas. So it will become a tool that you use in smart ways to make your business more efficient, or to create new business maybe. So finally, what is actually blockchain? Well, I'll start reading the top line. Oh, I can read it there too. So blockchain is a distributed ledger technology. What does that mean? Well, start with ledger technology. At its simplest, and I'm slightly oversimplifying, but at its simplest, a ledger is just a list of transactions in order. And so that's all it is in the end. It stores a list of transactions in order. But it's a distributed ledger, which means it's not one entity that holds that ledger. The ledger itself is replicated to a number of different points. So that's kind of the purple points in that ball. Everybody will have a copy of the ledger. And that's of course not particularly interesting if everybody wouldn't have the same copy of the ledger. So all these copies are identical. Now, how does that happen? That's a smart cryptographic protocol that makes sure that all these nodes negotiate with each other and come to an agreement in a smart way, in such a way that you know that if most of these nodes are honest, meaning they have not been hacked, they're not malfunctioning, they're up, etc., as long as you have an honest majority working there, then everybody will have the same view of the ledger. So the ledger will stay identical in all these different nodes, as long as most of the nodes keep working properly. If most of them start working badly, of course, things go bad. But if most of them work properly, then you're guaranteed that everybody has exactly the same view. Now, this is really interesting, because there's nothing in there that says that all of these nodes need to belong to one company, or you need to trust all of the nodes. You just need to trust most of them. And they can belong to different companies. They can belong to competitors. They can belong to partners in your ecosystem. And that's the really clever thing. So if you think about Bitcoin, how does this work with Bitcoin? Well, anybody can start a Bitcoin node. And as long as most of these people behave normal, honest, according to the rules of the system, then nothing will go wrong. And there are economic incentives in the Bitcoin protocol that make sure that everybody has an interest in being honest. So that's one of the clever things about Bitcoin, how they do that. But and that means that anybody can join, and we're still pretty much guaranteed that nothing will go wrong, that value will not go missing, that value will not be duplicated, etc. So if you have a certain amount of Bitcoin, you do some transactions, only the right transactions will happen. There will be no new transactions, no new value created that is not authorized, and there will be no value destroyed. So that's a really important feature. And that feature is called consensus, basically. The consensus is the protocol that makes sure that as long as we have most of these nodes, that's what I call the entities on the blockchain, most of these nodes are honest, then the consensus protocol will make sure that everybody stays in sync. Everybody has the same view of everything. One that's a little bit less important, but that's where the name actually comes from, is how is this done practically? Well, it's not one transaction at a time. that is agreed with the consensus protocol, that put together in blocks. That's the block bit of blockchain. So there's 100 or 1,000 or 10 or whatever your specific blockchain will do, transactions in one block. And these blocks are chained together, meaning each block will point to the previous block, and there's a cryptographic mechanism to make sure that that whole chain has to remain intact and will remain intact. There's a little note at the end there that says, however, other data structures are possible. And for example, the two I mentioned earlier, Corda and digital asset, actually don't use blocks in the way that is done here. Bitcoin does, Hyperledger Fabric does, Quorum does, and there's a whole range of others that do as well. So the standard technology does it in blocks. Some of them make an exception to that for whatever reasons. There's good reasons for that, believe me, but beyond the scope of what I wanted to talk about now. Cryptography and digital signatures. I don't want to say a lot about that, but cryptography and digital signatures are part of that smart cryptographic protocol, that consensus protocol that makes sure that we all stay in sync. And they're also a good way of making sure that the transactions we put onto the blockchain are actually secured, which is generally what happens. I'll get back to that later. And I really don't want to start explaining what a digital signature is, because you really don't need to understand how a digital signature works to understand how the blockchain works. So let's skip over that. Mechanisms to make it difficult to change historical records. Very, very, very difficult, in fact. And that's basically the chain that I mentioned earlier. The chain has a mechanism built into it to make sure that the chain as a whole remains intact. So once you have consensus on a transaction, it becomes part of the chain. And as soon as it's part of the chain, you will not be able to change it anymore. And that's what's called immutability, which is a slightly fancy word for you cannot change it. Immutable means unchangeable. So immutability is the thing that comes out of the chain in the blockchain. And the final thing, I already mentioned that blockchain is something that is distributed. So distributed means it's not one entity that runs all the nodes on this blockchain. So this whole ball here, this whole network is not run by one entity, by one company, or by one organization. It will typically be run by multiple organizations. So that might be divisions in one company that may have separate governance. It may be companies, different companies that could be competitors, or it could be partners in a whole supply chain, for example, or it could be a totally public network. It could be a consortium, but generally you'll have separate entities that run these different nodes in the blockchain. Okay, so I think that gives a slightly high-level overview of what blockchain is. So let's start talking about what technology benefits does this give us. Well, it's a large list here, and I'm going to go very quick because I'm going to zoom in on a few of these in the next slides. So a blockchain, everybody as a node has generally, again there are exceptions, but generally has the entire ledger, which means that you have access to everything on the blockchain. And it's universal. By universal, I mean everybody has the same view of that data. It's not that if I think a transaction has value 7 and somebody else has an idea that the value is 8, that won't happen. We both have the same view of the data. So there's a universal view across all these different companies on the blockchain. It's open source. Well, that's how it happens to have been built. Although almost all open source platforms also have an enterprise version with some extra features and support, etc. Trust, I'm going to talk about in some more detail later. Redundancy, I'm going to talk about in some more detail later. And it's relatively easy to see, actually. Redundancy is there's multiple nodes that all have a copy of the ledger. That's by definition redundancy. Disruption, I'm going to talk about later. So very briefly, to give you an idea of what is coming, disruption means you now have a completely new paradigm of how you communicate data, and that changes the business relationships. And if you change business relationships, you may be disrupting people in the business chain. That doesn't necessarily mean what is often said. I don't think it's as strong as often said. Disintermediation is a very strong word, and I'm not sure that's always the case. But that's an interesting thing that I'll get back to more. Anonymity is another interesting one which I'm not going to talk about. I could probably spend an hour on just anonymity. Speed is another interesting one. I talked about DTCC before, that project that we did. There's a press release out that has very high speed. In general, blockchain is not known for high speed. And I'll get back later to how even though your blockchain platform might be fairly slow, you still get significant speed benefits. Security, there's a whole section on that. I'm going to skip that. Safekeeping, ditto. Regulation, I'm going to touch on a little bit later. But if, for example, you would have a central bank issued digital cash, for example, by Bank of Thailand or Bank of Canada, then the Bank of Canada, the Bank of Thailand, that central bank could have a node on the blockchain. So by definition, they see everything that happens, which gives them additional regulatory benefits. And they know that they see the same as everybody else sees and that there's nothing that they don't see. So that has some regulatory benefits. There's more to that, and I'll get back later. Reconciliation, I'm going to talk about later. But again, this is about the idea that everybody sees the same data. And if you know that you don't see the same data, you know that you're already reconciled. Yep. So I've talked about distributed, and in fact, I prefer the word decentralized. And decentralized means there's no central point that does everything. So what do we actually decentralize? I already mentioned the storage is decentralized because every node on the blockchain will have a copy of the ledger. And you know it's the same copy, but that's now by definition a decentralized storage. There's multiple copies of your ledger database at multiple points in your blockchain network. The other thing that's distributed is the processing. So if you get a transaction in, that transaction is processed and put onto the blockchain, that process is also decentralized because that is done by a subset or all of the nodes on the blockchain to make sure all the ledgers stay up to date. Very important one is that the rules that determine what transaction is valid and what transactions are not valid may or may not be decentralized. So if you look at Bitcoin, if anybody really understands how the Bitcoin model works, and I'm not sure anybody exists, and there's lots of discussion about how this actually works, how the rules are changed for Bitcoin, but that is a fairly distributed mechanism. There's consensus on that, no pun intended. So in Bitcoin, you have the idea that there's this whole community that together determines that, oh, we are going to increase the block size, or we're not going to increase the block size. There was a very, very lengthy discussion about that, but it's a decentralized mechanism where there's multiple entities that all kind of vote in very complicated ways on what are the rules for what is a valid block in this case. But that doesn't need to be the case. For example, I mentioned Project Jasper earlier. In Project Jasper, we kind of took the assumption that it's the Bank of Canada that determines what is a valid cash transaction with cash on the ledger. So what is a valid central bank digital cash transaction? So that means that in that particular case, the rules are set centralized by the central bank, but they're executed by whoever happens to do a transaction. And the central bank doesn't actually need to be a part of that transaction. So that could work like Bank A makes a payment to Bank B, and the central bank is informed of that because they can see on the ledger that this transaction has happened, but they're not actually part of the transaction. That's truly a transaction between Bank A and Bank B. And I'll get back to that later. That has very interesting consequences. So decentralization is a very interesting aspect. Governance doesn't need to be decentralized. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. And generally, there's a whole range of options there. It's not black and white, in other words. You can be somewhat decentralized or somewhat centralized, etc. So I mentioned before, talking about redundancy. I like the word resilience for this. What does resilience mean? Well, resilience means that if some of your nodes crash, I mean, it's software crashes, or the internet connection gets disrupted, or they get hacked and they have to switch it off, or whatever happens. If some of those nodes are not functioning properly, the whole network still can keep working. So if Bank B or bank C, or the central bank goes down, the other banks can still transact between themselves because the network is resilient. So there's no single point of failure in that sense. And that means security-wise, if some of the entities get hacked, then not the whole thing falls apart. That's what the security of the blockchain platform makes sure of. It also means for availability, if it just stupid software crash and you disappear from the internet, the rest of the network can keep working. Data-wise, the same thing happens. There's no one golden copy of the data. So if you think about, again, cash on a blockchain, you can make transactions between yourself and you know what cash you own. You don't need to go to your bank to figure out how much cash you own. There's no one central copy at the bank that knows who owns how much money. Because everybody basically has that information, and you can look at the blockchain and determine, oh, this is mine, that's mine, and the rest isn't, so this is my balance. Because every participant has a trustworthy, because of all these smart consensus mechanisms, and a synchronized copy of the ledger. So you have very high data availability and durability. So if your database goes completely, it crashes and you lose your disk, you can resynchronize with somebody else's copy of the ledger and you're back in business. You have not lost anything. Yep. Trust, I know I mentioned that earlier. So what does trust really mean? There's often very sweeping comments. It's on the blockchain so you can trust it. Well, that's not quite true. If you put garbage on the blockchain, it's still garbage. It doesn't suddenly make it gold. It doesn't happen. So putting something on the blockchain doesn't make it trusted. So what does trust really mean? Trust means that you know who put it there. So you know the source of the data is. You know that it's valid because everybody has executed the rules, making sure that this is a valid transaction before we allow it to become part of the ledger. So we know that it's valid, it has satisfied the rules. It's consistent because all of the participants, you know that all of the participants have the same data, and you know that it's immutable, that once it's there, you can't change it anymore. Those are the things you can trust. And that's a very important and very powerful feature, but it's not magic. It's not you put it on the blockchain and it becomes trusted. If you put it on the blockchain, you know those four things. You know who put it there, you know that it is a valid transaction, you know that everybody knows it, and you know that you won't be able to change it anymore. So the result of that is, and I think this comes from R3, I think it was the CTO, Richard Brown, who said it, reconcile as you go. So I know that what I see is the same as what you see, because all of our copies of the ledger are up to date, in sync, and they have the same value. So I know that what you see is what I see. And that means we don't need to have some complicated reconciliation mechanism to make sure that we have the same data. We already know that we have the same data because we both read it off our copy of the blockchain. Another thing that's a very technical thing is this is a secure, verifiable audit trail. You can give an auditor a copy of the blockchain, and they can, if they want to, run all the transactions, see that they're indeed all valid, and see that they're identical to what's on the blockchain. And audit becomes a very technical matter in that way. That will not be all that there is to audit, but certain parts of audit will be completely automated, and just because it's on the blockchain, you know that it's good. So audit becomes something that is more technically secure than it currently is in many systems. And a very important thing to mention here is that you get that level of trust without needing a central authority that you trust to keep the books. So you don't need a bank or a central bank that says, you own so much money, you own so much money, because you can see on the blockchain who owns what money. And that's secured without needing to trust one specific company or entity on that blockchain. So that's a decentralized bit again showing up. And this is an interesting one. The next one is tokenization. So there's a very interesting thing with digital stuff. And I'm going to ignore for a minute what's on the screen there. Imagine that I have a 100 baht bill. Everybody can see that I own it. I should get one out of my wallet, but imagine there's a 100 baht bill here. Everybody could see that I own that 100 baht bill. If I give it to one of you, everybody knows that I no longer have it, and whoever I gave it to now has it. There's only one copy of this. That doesn't work with the digital stuff. The digital stuff, I can just copy the bits, and I can give it to all of you, and all of you now have that string of bits. And that's why traditionally, if we wanted to have value in electronic format, we needed to have a trusted authority that kept track of who owns that string of bits at this point in time. You needed to trust somebody to say, it's Peter that owns this 100 baht, this digital 100 baht bill, and not anybody of you in the room. And if I give it to somebody else, they take the ownership away from me and put it to that one other person. So that's the central authority you need to have to transfer that ownership right. On a blockchain, you can do much better than that. You don't need that central authority anymore. And this is where the disruption and all that kind of stuff comes from. You no longer need to trust your bank to know how much money you own. You manage that yourself. Because every participant now manages their own tokens, and there are mechanisms built into the blockchain to make sure that we do this. And that is done by setting those rules for what is a valid transaction in a smart way. So what do? We say, Peter has a public key, and we attach that bill to the public key on the blockchain. We make that relationship on the blockchain, and everybody can see that relationship. That cannot be changed because it's now on the blockchain and it's immutable. So if I now want to transfer that, I use my public key to sign a transaction that I send it over to Boy. And I basically attach that value to his public key, and now everybody can see that he owns it. And why is this secure? Well, only I have the private key corresponding to this, so only I can make that digital signature. That means that none of you can grab ownership of that thing unless you happen to have my key. So the digital signature means that only the owner of the thing, only the owner of that 100 baht, that digital 100 baht bill can assign it to somebody else. So now we can suddenly have uniqueness in digital content, which is really interesting. And this is, of course, how Bitcoin works. And this is how a lot of things work. And I'll get back to that a little bit later. See that I need to speed up. Oh, maybe not as much as I thought. So this is actually a good segue into security. So why is security important? Well, we just talked about me transferring value to somebody else. And you notice that I was talking about I'm signing something, and the blockchain is recording that. So the recording bit is very secure. Once I've done that, it becomes a transaction on the blockchain, and it's immutable, and nobody can change that anymore. But I've done something before I put it on the blockchain. There's a key involved there. And that's what I mean, or that's what the slide means about an asset, meaning my digital 100 baht bill, and the means of protection, the key that I have, are combined. And the key doesn't actually live on the blockchain. I don't want my private key on the blockchain because then everybody sees it and everybody can sign away ownership of that thing. So I want to hold that private key, so only I can sign a transaction that I then put onto the blockchain. So there's this whole load of things happening before it becomes part of the blockchain. And that is what's meant by digital wallets have been proven easy to exploit. You have probably seen about all kinds of hacks. And again, I'm talking about Bitcoin and not about enterprise blockchains, but the concepts are somewhat similar here. You've seen all these hacks on Bitcoin, and all of those are the Bitcoin network has kept perfect track of who owns what. It's just that this one exchange, Mt. Gox, or there have been a few others, and I forget their names recently. There was one in Hong Kong, there was one in Korea, I believe. they basically lost their customers' keys to a hacker. And now the hacker has the key, and the hacker owns the Bitcoin and can transfer it to themselves on an anonymous address and quickly turn it into dollar or baht, and they made a lot of profit. And all the people who used to have money in that exchange just lost it. Bitcoin has worked properly, but the layer above it, that digital wallet, as we like to call it, that layer is not secure. So there's a lot more to security than just the blockchain is secure. You have to secure all the layers on top of it as well. So with that, let's talk about those layers. So let's start from the bottom. You have the blockchain platform security, and it has a lot of built-in security features. And that's what I talked about before, the immutability, the knowledge that everything the integrity is maintained. You know that everything is a valid transaction, that these rules have been checked by everybody. You can have things called atomic transactions, meaning a transaction either completes entirely or it doesn't complete at all. You can get halfway through a transaction and then get stuck there. And that's interesting if you do an exchange. If I have a 100 baht bill and you have a $2.50 bill, I'm not sure if those exist, but is that about right? $2.50? Yeah, I think it is, right? Then we could exchange those, and we could have one transaction where I give my 100 baht bill to you, and you give your $2.50 bill to me in one transaction. And of course, what we would like is that they both execute at the same time, and not that you get my 100 baht bill but keep your $2.50. That's not good. Or the other way around. You want to make sure that either both happen or neither of them happen. So atomic transactions do that. So there's lots of security features in the platform, but not everything is there, as I said before. If I lose my key that controls my 100 baht, then I lose my 100 baht. So we need to have application security on top of it. And if we implement this in software, then I probably need a firewall in front of it, a web application firewall. I need to do security monitoring. I need to do all kinds of other things around it to make sure that this whole thing is secure. In the end, once we have a blockchain platform with a blockchain application on top of it, we still need to build all the usual security things around an application, just like any other application. In the end, once we've turned it into software, it's software. We need to do all the things that we do for any software. And I've called that cybersecurity, general cybersecurity. So code scanning, API gateways, blah, 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 blah. Talk to your IT security department. They'll love that bit, and they know that bit already. And all of these things we need to apply to the entire range of security controls. So we need to look at who has access to this. And that's around making sure that nobody but me can access my key. So that's having good access control. I need to authenticate me properly before my key can be used. It's about governance and compliance. If you have a consortium of companies doing something together, you are somewhat relying on the majority working well. So you probably want to have some compliance protocol to make sure that everybody complies with certain security standards, because if too many get hacked, then you get a problem. If one or two get hacked, no issue. But if 2/3 of the participants get hacked, we have a problem. It's much better than it is now, of course, because currently if one entity gets hacked, you have a problem. So it's better than it was, but you still want to think about the bad case where too many people got hacked. So you want to have governance. There's the general application security stuff. In the end, it's software. You need to think about your software security, your application security. You want to talk about security in your infrastructure. You want to talk about proper security monitoring. If you have a very secure system, but you're not looking at it, you don't even know that you're being hacked. And that's actually turning out to be a big, big problem. So make sure that you monitor it. And finally, make sure that you're ahead of the threats. If there is a known vulnerability in one part of your software, you're still running this on an operating system. Don't run it on Windows 2000. That's a little out of date by now. You want to make sure that you keep up to date on all your software, including your blockchain platform software. So you need to make sure that all your threat and vulnerability management is up to date. So we're hoping, of course, that you'll come to a company like ourselves, or preferably like Accenture, but make sure that you cover all of those things when you talk about when you talk about blockchain. In the end, it gives you certain security features, but it doesn't give you everything. It's, in the end, a blockchain is a tool that has built-in security, but it's still a tool that becomes part of a bigger thing, and you need to secure the bigger thing and don't stop with just the blockchain itself. So finally, the real meat, and this is where I want to talk about how do you actually build use cases. And well, this is a slide that shows what we could possibly do on a blockchain. And there's an enormous amount that could be done. And we've actually done quite a few of them. I mentioned post-trade settlement, Project Jasper. I mentioned DTCC, which does something somewhat similar, but looks at the performance aspects. We have a booth outside talking about track and trace. I think that's somewhere on here. Yes, identity and traceability, anti-counterfeit, track and trace for medical supplies. I'm involved in a project at the moment looking at commodities trading. How do warehouses and commodity traders keep track of who owns what in a certain warehouse? You can do that on a blockchain. There is smart contracts, there's payment processing, and that's one where I'll go a little bit deeper on this. And you can do digital asset management. And all of these things are based on certain of the features I've mentioned before, like you have uniqueness of digital items on a blockchain. And once you have that, you can, of course, have an asset registry that tracks that item that is used in the traceability. So how do you actually pick your use case? So I decided not to go through an enormous number of use cases. I'm going to fix one and then talk about how do you actually do this in practice. So the one I've picked, and that's partly inspired by where I am today, Bank of Thailand, so central bank digital currency. That's one reason. The other reason was this setup that is on this slide has actually been used in Project Ubin, by the Monetary Authority in Singapore, Project Jasper, both phase 1, 2, and 3 has this as a component. So that's Canada, Bank of Canada, Payments Canada, and there's a number of other items. And this general setup is actually quite common. And there's loads and loads of variants. So don't take this as this is how you have to do it, but this is how you could do it. So what is the idea of this? Well, the idea of this is that you're not going to go to central bank digital currency and get rid of the existing systems in one go. So we'll have the existing systems, and in the picture they're at the top. So this is talking about the accounts that major commercial banks have with the central bank. So it's a real-time gross settlement system. I should have looked this up, but I don't know what it's called in Thailand. But in the UK, it's actually called RTGS, real-time gross settlement. In Canada, it's called LVTS, large value transaction system, I believe. So there's different names for it, but it's how banks make large payments and think of millions or multiple millions of dollars per transaction. I think the average transaction value in certain countries is more than $1 million. So they're large value transactions. And to do these, banks have accounts with the central bank. And the current system is they tell the central bank, Bank A tells the central bank, I want to transfer $1 million to Bank B. And then the central bank updates their ledgers, and that's it. This would put part of those transactions onto a blockchain. And how do we do that? Well, we want to make sure that we don't create new money. So if we take, we want to basically allow the banks to buy digital currency. And when they do that, the central bank will take money out of their existing account and put it in a pool account. I'll get in a minute to why we put it in a pool account. And at the same time, if they say, I want $10 million, they take $10 million out of their account and put it in the pool, and they issue $10 million in digital currency on the blockchain, owned by that bank. So you've noticed that the bank now has less money in their account at the issue, but they have the same amount of money in total because they have that digital depository receipt, that's how we call it, on ledger. Why is it called a digital depository receipt? Well, if that bank transfers it to another bank, which they can do as a blockchain transaction without needing involvement, oversight, but no real-time involvement by the central bank, then that other bank can deposit it back at the central bank and get money in their account. And that's why we have that pool account there, because the central bank will take the money out of the pool, give it to the second bank, and destroy the digital cash. And what you'll notice here, the reason that pool is there is that the total amount of money doesn't change. So you can, as a central bank, you keep controlling your total amount of money. Of course, this particular case is not that interesting, because why would you take money in digital, transfer it over, and immediately turn it back? Why did you just make the transaction up there? There's no need for there only to be one transaction at the bottom. Bank 1 can transfer it to Bank 2 can transfer some of it to Bank 3 and some of it to Bank 4. Banks 3 and 4 can transact some of their money with others and keep floating around for a long time. And then all of these banks, whatever they have in the digital depository receipts, can redeem that and get money in their account. And that could, for example, happen 24/7. It could, for example, happen when the central bank is offline. And this sounds like something very unlikely, but it has been published that the Bank of England, and I believe it was the Bank of Zimbabwe, interesting combination, both went offline for extended amounts of time, and banks could not make those transfers for a day. And I have good reason to believe that there were more cases, but they were just not published. So this does actually happen. The central bank sometimes has a crash in their systems, and they cannot, none of the banks can transact. That wouldn't be the case with this. There's actually something more interesting about this, because if you have tokens, you can do what I said before. And this is what we did in Project Jasper. If you have a token that represents cash, we can do something very similar and have a token that represents a share. And now we can buy and sell shares in an atomic transaction, one transaction where we swap these out. And that's something that wasn't possible until recently. So if you look at all these systems, they do the settlement in two phases typically, where the shares are exchanged in real time, but the cash is only exchanged at the end of the day. And that means you have a risk for the entire day that at the end of the day there won't be any money for you. If you do this in real time in one transaction, suddenly you get benefits there. You get reduced friction because of this. And because the role of the central counterparty, the central party has changed here, the role of the central bank is truly, in this case, supervisory and not necessarily managing transactions anymore. You have new business opportunities. And I'm not going to go in great detail, in part because I'm going to skip this for a second and go to this, the next one first. If I have time left, I'll go to this one. Hello? And this is the central thing I wanted to talk about. If you just do the same thing that you've done, that you do in your current business, and you take all your existing business processes and you're going to put them on a blockchain, then you still have the same business processes. Nothing has changed. And the only thing you really get at that point in time is the improved resilience, the reduced single points of failure that you get because of blockchain, reduced reconciliation costs, because remember, it's reconcile as you go. I know that what you see is what I see. We see the same thing, so we don't need a separate reconciliation step. We catch errors earlier. That's another way of saying the same thing. We know that we catch errors earlier, so we have less reconciliation processes. So things get a bit cheaper, things get a bit more efficient. That's not why we want to do blockchain. We want to do blockchain because we can simplify these processes. If we know that we don't have to do a reconciliation process, we don't need to wait. I talked before about post-trade settlement on the exchange. If you sell and sell equities on the stock exchange, in your account it looks like it happens instantly. In reality, it takes up to 2 days. 2 days later, called T+2 typically, before that transaction actually happens in the underlying systems. There's 2 days delay in there. There's a large number of reasons for that, but one of them is reconciliation, because everybody has their own systems, takes a long time. And if there's errors, we need time to be able to fix them. If you simplify these processes, that's one tool you can use to reduce that amount of time. If you reduce that amount of time, you reduce friction, you reduce costs. So that's a real benefit. You can simplify processes. I mentioned before, a real-time gross settlement system for banks has two roles. They execute the processes and they have a supervisory role. If we do this on a blockchain, we can split those, because the supervisory role is a governance thing and it's a tracking thing, but they don't need to be part of the execution. That's what I mentioned on one of the early slides. The rules for what is a valid transaction can be done centrally, so the central bank can set the rules of what is a valid transaction, but they don't need to execute that transaction. The transaction can be executed in a distributed fashion. So that means the roles of parties change. So that's all optimizing business, but you can also do things in a completely different way because things are decentralized. You can possibly do entirely new things that you couldn't do before, and I cannot give you any details alas, but I was involved in one trade finance project in Scandinavia, so that was Finland, Sweden, Norway and Denmark, and they were looking at trade finance doing a type of business they couldn't currently do at all, and they could do it on a blockchain because of its decentralized nature. So that is that will be where the real value is, and to that extent we're actually a little bit where the internet was in 1995. We know it's really exciting, we can do these really exciting things and we have ideas of where it's going, but I don't think anybody fully knows where it goes yet. This is where the real interesting problem lies. How do we create new ways of doing existing business? How do we significantly simplify existing business? Or how do we create completely new lines of business by using these new exciting tools that blockchain gives us? I think that's the last slide I had, so I'm going to go back to this one for a sec. Ooh. One less. How much time do I have? I'll keep going. Oh. Let's go to this one. Okay. So I mentioned shift of thinking. Shift of thinking is a very important thing. So what do we need to address before this blockchain hype becomes reality? That's really what I'm trying to say here. So one is a shift in thinking. We really want to exploit the full benefits of blockchain. We have to do what I just referred to. We have to think of these new ways of doing business. And that requires a new mental model, not just for the business people, but also for the technical people. Because a distributed application is structured in a different way than a regular old-fashioned client-server application that we're all used to. So distributed applications work in different ways, both on the business and on the technical level. Governance is going to be very important because you have now multiple organizations that might be competitors or that might have completely separate roles, like trade finance is a good example where you have shippers and handlers and owners and container companies, and you have customs, and they have completely different roles and completely different perspectives on something, but they need to agree on what the rules are. So governance is going to be a really interesting one. And that's not just governance on a business level, but also on a technical level. So that starts going into operations. How do you jointly agree on how things should operate? Privacy considerations, I said before, that's a huge thing. Because a blockchain publishes everything and everybody has a copy of the ledger, privacy is a little bit challenging. And there are partial solutions for this. So you can, rather than have your identity on the blockchain, you could have a pseudonym on the blockchain. So you're just 1234 ABC instead of your Bob. That's nice, but that doesn't really give you full privacy. And there's a huge trade-off with the verifiability of the blockchain. And in fact, it turns out that if you look at a technical level, there's a trade-off between performance and privacy, interestingly. I think that's subject for an entire 2-hour presentation, so I won't go further. And finally, implementation. There's still a lack of agreed tools, and this is a very new area. But I think the real key bit is actually at the top. We need to think of how can we design new ways of doing business, how can we design new business by using blockchain. Do I have any time left? Okay, wrap up. Okay, so you saw a picture of the world there with where central bank digital currency has been done. I didn't check whether Thailand was on there, but it should be. It was. Okay, good. And you see that this is started to gain momentum. That's the thing I wanted to say about that one. But this is what I had to tell you. I hope this was of interest to you. Kaput Kap.